Before the myth, before the blood-soaked duels and the frontier justice, there was a boy, born into the quiet hum of rural life and the roar of a divided nation. The wind that swept across the prairies of Illinois in the early 19th century carried more than the scent of freshly plowed earth. It carried the first whispers of war, freedom, and fate. And in the heart of this land, a legend was born. His name was James Butler Hickok, but history would come to know him by another, Wild Bill. He was born on May 27, 1837, in LaSalle County, Illinois, to a farming family rooted in strong abolitionist beliefs. His father, William Alonzo Hickok, was a man of conviction, one who hid runaway slaves beneath his floorboards and stood for what was right, even when it meant risking everything. His mother, Polly Butler, passed on a fierce independence that would later blaze through her son like prairie fire. From an early age, James was different. He wasn't just curious, he was restless, and the land itself seemed to mirror that fire. The young boy spent his days working the fields, hunting for food, and learning to live by instinct. But more than anything, he learned to shoot. And not just with skill, with grace, with precision, and with something else no one could quite define. By his teenage years, James Hickok was already considered one of the finest marksmen in the region. Townsfolk spoke his name with a mix of admiration and caution. They said he could hit a squirrel's eye from across a clearing, reload without looking, and split a playing card mid-air with a single bullet. But greatness has a price, and destiny never waits politely. By the time he was 18 years old, Hickok found himself caught in a violent turn that would send him hurtling toward history. While working for the Illinois Central Railroad, he got into a brutal altercation with another man named Charles Hudson. The details are murky. Some say it was over a woman, others say it was about money, but what is certain is that the fight turned deadly, or so Hickok believed. Hudson was dragged from the water after the two men nearly drowned each other in a river brawl. Onlookers screamed that Hudson was dead. James, panic gripping his spine like a vice, didn't wait to find out. He ran. He didn't just flee the scene, he fled the life he had known. With nothing but his instincts, a revolver, and the fire of fear in his gut, James Butler Hickok headed west, abandoning Illinois for the rough territories of Kansas and Nebraska. The man who had once been a farm boy now walked among gunslingers, outlaws, scouts, and soldiers. He no longer used the name James. To the men on the frontier, he was William Hickok, taking his father's name as a kind of armor, a disguise perhaps, or maybe a rebirth. The West would not be kind to him, but it would make him eternal. As he wandered into the wilderness of the Great Plains, he encountered a world still raw with danger and promise. Settlements were few, roads were rough, towns were ruled not by laws, but by who could draw fastest. It was a crucible for the strong and a death sentence for the unprepared. But James Butler Hickok, now Bill, was neither naive nor weak. He survived by adapting, by reading men as easily as tracks in the dust, and by keeping his trigger finger ready. He took on jobs where others wouldn't dare. Wagon driver, scout, pony express rider, stagecoach guard. Every role was a step deeper into the unforgiving marrow of the American West. Every mile rode further away from the boy he had once been, and closer to the gunfighter legend he would become. Still, something more than survival drove him. Something like justice, something like fate. The abolitionist blood still ran hot in his veins. He couldn't shake the sense that he had to fight, not just to stay alive, but to stand for something greater than himself. And though his journey was forged by violence, it was also shaped by a moral compass, one that, even in the most brutal chapters of his life, refused to spin wild. The river fight with Hudson had marked the turning point. What began as a desperate escape from justice became the first page of a new story, one of duels, saloons, lawman duties, and battlefields. Though the newspapers would later call him a killer, a lawman, a hero, and an outlaw, all at once, James Butler Hickok was something even rarer. He was real, flawed, fearless, and fascinating, a man of paradoxes born from fire and silence, shaped by hardship, and sharpened like the blade of a bowie knife by the hard edge of frontier life. In the quiet woods of Illinois, few could have imagined what that boy would become. Fewer still could predict how the sound of his revolver would one day echo across the plains and into the pages of history. This was only the beginning. The world would come to know his name, not as James, not as Butler, but as Wild Bill, and the West would never be the same. The wind across the Nebraska plains in 1861 carried dust, danger, and the heavy scent of war brewing back east. But in the raw, untamed stretches of the American West, that distant conflict seemed like thunder on the horizon. Life here was harsher, simpler, and deadlier. And for James Butler Hickok, a young man forging his destiny in the saddle, it was the perfect place for a legend to begin. By this point, Hickok had vanished into the veins of the frontier, leaving behind his family, his name, and his past. Working odd jobs, riding through hostile territory, and guarding treasure-laden coaches, he lived day to day as a scout, a marksman, and a man hardened by isolation. Among his most daring assignments was his time with the Pony Express, a short-lived but storied courier service that connected the American coasts at breakneck speed. Riding for the Pony Express wasn't just dangerous, it was damn near suicidal. Riders galloped through desolate, hostile country, vulnerable to raids, ambushes, and brutal weather. But Hickok, with his nerves of iron and uncanny aim, fit right into the saddle-bound chaos. He also served as a stagecoach guard, protecting passengers and gold from bandits and native raiding parties. Those who worked with him said he was polite but quiet, fiercely loyal, and unnervingly calm in the face of danger. Behind his cool demeanor lay a powder keg of violence, waiting for a spark. That spark would ignite in a place called Rock Creek Station, Nebraska Territory. The year was 1861. Hickok had been working for the Russell, Majors, and Waddell Freight Company, which operated a relay station at Rock Creek, one of many waypoints used by the Pony Express and stage lines. It was here that Hickok came face to face with fate, violence, and infamy. The station itself was tense. Ownership disputes, unpaid debts, and territorial tempers turned the place into a pressure cooker. Hickok, then just 24 years old, was stationed there alongside the station manager Horace Wellman and a man named J.W. Brink. Enter David McCanleys, a local landowner, known bully, and former owner of the station property. He arrived at Rock Creek with 2 men and his 12-year-old son, Monroe, demanding overdue payments or repossession of the property. Accounts differ wildly from here, and truth is harder to find than gold in the riverbed. Some say McCanleys barged into the station, armed and aggressive. Others claim he was unarmed and merely wanted his money. But what happened next would ripple through history. 3 men ended up dead: McCanleys, his cousin James Woods, and an associate named James Gordon. Young Monroe McCanleys fled the scene and later recounted the bloodshed, a story echoed and twisted by newspapers across the country. What is known is this: Hickok fired the first and possibly fatal shots. From behind a curtain or hidden in the shadows, he shot McCanleys dead. Brink and Wellman reportedly finished the job, and the 2 others were killed in the resulting firefight. Some claimed that Hickok alone killed all 3 men, a tale that grew with every retelling. In the weeks that followed, rumors spread like wildfire. Newspapers inflated the body count to 9 or 10 men, portraying Hickok as a one-man army who had calmly cut down an entire gang of attackers. It was a classic tale of frontier justice, and the public loved it. A young man standing alone against impossible odds, defending a besieged outpost with courage and deadly precision. It was the perfect material for dime novels, barroom yarns, and war-weary Easterners desperate for heroes. And just like that, a quiet, deadly man named James Hickok became Wild Bill. It wasn't just a nickname, it was a transformation. The name Wild Bill first appeared in public around this time, likely coined to bury the old life of a fugitive and replace it with the myth of a fearless frontiersman. Hickok embraced it. He grew out his hair, let his mustache fall in elegant waves, and cultivated an image of deadly poise, silent strength, and raw, untouchable masculinity. The transformation worked. Hickok became an icon, the kind of man who walked into a saloon and silenced the room with a glance, the kind of man who wore his pistols reversed in his sash like a cavalry officer and was always ready to draw, the kind of man who would go down in history, whether he wanted to or not. After the Rock Creek shootout, Hickok, Wellman, and Brink were arrested and charged with murder. But the trial, held in the lawless, windswept courts of frontier justice, quickly found the trio not guilty, citing self-defense and the protection of company property. Still, whispers of doubt clung to the verdict. Did Wild Bill execute an unarmed man behind a curtain? Was the station manager the true aggressor? Or was the entire scene one of chaotic survival? The truth is likely lost to time, but in the minds of many the story didn't need clarity. It needed power. And that's what Hickok's legend delivered. Despite the bravado assigned to him, Hickok never bragged about Rock Creek. He didn't boast, he didn't gloat. He simply moved forward, colder, quieter, and now bound to a name that would follow him for the rest of his life. He wasn't a man seeking glory. He was a man outrunning ghosts. The Rock Creek incident revealed something deeper about Wild Bill. He lived by a code, but he was also shaped by violence, and not always in control of it. It made him feared, respected, but it also set him on a path that would isolate him from peace, from love, and eventually from the law itself. Rock Creek didn't just launch a legend, it changed the landscape of the American West. This was the first domino, the first gunshot in a long, bloody opera of duels, badges, and betrayal. It was the moment when a nameless scout became the prototype for every gunslinger, every sheriff, every silent-eyed killer who walked the pages of frontier history after him. Wild Bill Hickok didn't just survive Rock Creek, he became Rock Creek. And from that moment forward, the West would never forget his name. Before the revolvers, before the saloons, before the legends written in blood and myth, James Butler Hickok served in the shadows of a nation tearing itself apart. When the first shots of the American Civil War echoed across Fort Sumter in 1861, the country splintered in two, North against South, brother against brother, freedom against slavery. It was not just a war for territory, it was a reckoning for the soul of a nation, and in the border states, where allegiance shifted like the wind and danger crept in from every hill and riverbank, the need for men like Hickok became undeniable. Still bearing the weight of the Rock Creek incident, and newly cloaked in the rising reputation of Wild Bill, Hickok enlisted, not for fame, but for purpose. He took up arms for the Union, aligning his blood with the abolitionist beliefs instilled in him as a boy on his father's farm in Illinois. But unlike most who donned blue coats and marched into open battlefields, Hickok moved like a ghost, infiltrating enemy lines, gathering intelligence, and surviving where others vanished. Official records are scattered, lost among scorched pages of history and censored dispatches. But surviving testimonies, letters, and military lore speak of a man who served as a scout, a spy, and an undercover agent in the most perilous theaters of the war. He operated in Missouri, Arkansas, Kansas, and the Indian Territories, lands choked with guerrilla fighters, Confederate sympathizers, and shifting loyalties. In this chaotic frontier of war, the line between soldier and outlaw blurred, and Hickok walked it like a tightrope. He disguised himself, rode alone for days across hostile territory, and memorized entire landscapes like they were etched into the back of his hand. He was a human compass, a hunter with unshakable instincts and nerves carved from iron. Union generals knew his value. Men like General Samuel R. Curtis and George Armstrong Custer would later speak of Hickok's usefulness, not just for his pistol skill, but for his uncanny ability to read danger and disappear before it struck. He wasn't just a warrior, he was a weapon. Yet this was no glory-filled parade of medals. The work was dirty, lonely, and thankless. Hickok saw atrocities on both sides, massacres, betrayals, towns burned to the ground. He witnessed the moral grey of war up close, but he never faltered. His purpose was clarity in the chaos. His duty was death delivered at the right time to the right enemy in the name of the Union. There were stories, perhaps exaggerated, perhaps not, that Hickok on one mission spent weeks embedded with Confederate raiders, feeding coded messages back to Union scouts. Another tale said he single-handedly warned a Kansas town of a pending Confederate ambush, saving dozens from slaughter. But the truth, even stripped of embellishment, remained undeniable. The Civil War made Hickok a master of survival, deception, and precision. By war's end in 1865, James Butler Hickok was no longer simply a crack shot or a brave scout. He was something more dangerous, a man who knew war intimately, who had killed not out of rage but by cold necessity, and who now carried that burden in silence. But fate was not finished with him yet. No sooner had he sheathed his pistol than destiny came calling again, this time in a dusty square in Missouri, where the eyes of the West would turn to him forever. In the wake of war and gunfights, the name Wild Bill Hickok traveled farther than any bullet he ever fired. But it wasn't just the frontier that whispered of his deeds. It was the polished hands of East Coast publishers, desperate to bring the wildness of the West to civilized drawing rooms. And so, in 1867, one article changed everything. Enter George Ward Nichols, a journalist for Harper's New Monthly magazine, one of the most influential publications in America at the time. Nichols sought adventure. He wanted to chronicle not just the politics and wars of a growing nation, but the raw, mythic heart of the expanding West. What he found was James Butler Hickok, then living in Springfield, Missouri, a man already known in military and frontier circles, but still living largely in obscurity to the general public. Nichols sat with Hickok. He listened. He took notes. But he did not just transcribe. He sculpted a legend. The resulting article, titled Wild Bill, appeared in the February 1867 issue of Harper's, and it lit the match that ignited Hickok's national fame. In vivid, almost biblical prose, Nichols described Wild Bill as a giant among men, a gunslinger so fast that death seemed to obey his draw. According to Nichols, Hickok had slain hundreds of men, survived countless duels, and could shoot the head off a bird mid-flight while riding full gallop through hostile country. Most of it was exaggerated, if not outright fiction. But that didn't matter. The public devoured the story. They weren't just reading about a man, they were witnessing the birth of the first true gunfighter celebrity. Wild Bill Hickok became not just a name, but a mythic archetype. He was no longer just a former scout, soldier, and gambler. He was the West incarnate, deadly, stoic, moral, and untouchable. Eastern cities, far removed from the blood-soaked saloons and dusty showdowns of the frontier, clung to every word. Illustrations of Hickok appeared alongside the article. Flowing hair, piercing eyes, twin pistols worn reversed in a sash, the stance of a man forever between peace and violence. He was the real-life cowboy hero in a time before Hollywood, standing where law, chaos, and honor collided. But Hickok himself, he hated the article. In later letters and interviews, he dismissed Nichols's claims as embellishments, even as the fame they brought followed him everywhere. People now recognized him in every saloon, gambling house, and railroad depot. Some wanted autographs. Others wanted to test the legend for themselves with fists or guns. And so began a new chapter of his life, one where the burden of legend became heavier than the gun on his hip. If Harper's turned him into a myth, the towns of Hays City and Abilene would test whether Wild Bill could live up to it. In the lawless heart of Kansas, two towns bled violence into the dirt. Cattle drives, whiskey, gambling, and a constant flow of desperate men made Hays City and Abilene explosive powder kegs. These were towns where lawmen were shot in the back, where cowboys rode their horses into saloons, and townsfolk prayed for daylight. Into this chaos rode Wild Bill Hickok. In 1869, he was appointed a deputy U.S. Marshal in Hays City, a town where being sheriff was a death sentence. Hickok brought with him not just a reputation, but a presence. He walked slow, talked little, and wore his revolvers like a judge wore robes, tools of finality. Within weeks of arriving in Hays, he had already killed 2 men in shootouts. The first was Bill Mulvey, a known drunken thug who rode into town firing his gun and bragging he'd kill Hickok. Wild Bill, calm as a midnight shadow, told the crowd to step aside. As Mulvey raised his rifle, Hickok raised his voice. "Don't shoot him in the back, boys. He's been drinking." And then he drew and shot Mulvey clean off his horse. The second bullet, insurance, ended it. Another killing followed just a month later. Sam Strawhun, a drunken cowboy smashing up saloons, refused to drop his weapon. Witnesses claimed Hickok acted without mercy. Others said he gave ample warning. Either way, Strawhun was buried the next morning, and Hickok's reputation as an unflinching agent of justice only grew. But his time in Hays was brief. Even Hickok, with all his fire and fury, couldn't keep the town from consuming itself. He left behind a graveyard and a warning. Law here came with a cost. Then came Abilene. In 1871, Hickok became Marshal of Abilene, the wildest cowtown in the West. The cattle trade turned every summer into a storm of violence, with thousands of cowboys, gamblers, and gunslingers flooding in. Hickok was given a badge and told to do whatever it took to maintain order. He did. With cold resolve and deadly precision, Wild Bill cleaned up the town. He banned firearms within city limits, faced down gangs, and patrolled the streets alone, a spectral figure in a black frock coat. His very presence kept many outlaws at bay, but others, emboldened by drink or arrogance, tried their luck. They died. Still, his greatest tragedy, and the final nail in his lawman career, came on an October night in 1871. During a saloon shootout, Hickok saw a shadowy figure rushing in from behind. Instinct took over. He turned and fired. It was Mike Williams, his close friend and deputy. Hickok shot him dead. The bullet that ended Williams' life broke Hickok in ways no duel or war ever had. He paid for the funeral. He traveled to explain to Williams' widow what had happened, and he never wore a badge again. The legend had survived Rock Creek, the war, and dozens of showdowns. But in one flash of misjudged instinct, Wild Bill Hickok's lawman days ended, not in a blaze of glory, but in grief and guilt. In the twilight of a life paved in gunpowder and shadow, James Butler Wild Bill Hickok, the living legend of the West, found something unexpected: love. Not the kind shouted across smoky saloons or scribbled into the back pages of dime novels, but something gentler, older, and aching with longing. A bond with a woman named Agnes Thatcher Lake. Agnes was not a common frontier flower. She was a self-made woman, a widow, and a celebrated circus performer and manager. Her life had been one of its own wild rides, traveling from town to town under the flapping canvas of her own circus empire. She was respected in a way most women weren't in those days, wealthy, independent, and unafraid to command a stage or steer a business. Their worlds collided like thunder meeting still air. Bill, born of frontier blood and forged by violence, was unlike the men of eastern cities and genteel ballrooms. And Agnes, who had survived heartbreak and raised a daughter while touring the ragged edges of the American continent, was nothing like the women who populated frontier saloons or whispered in the corners of smoky gambling halls. By the time they met, Bill was weary, not broken but burdened. He had carried fame like a noose around his neck. Every town he entered brought challengers, young men hungry to make a name by gunning down the great Wild Bill. He was older now, though still sharp, still fast, but he had begun to feel the weight of every man he'd ever killed, and worse, the memory of the one he never meant to. Mike Williams, the friend he shot in a tragic mistake. Agnes saw through the legend. She didn't love the gunfighter. She loved James Butler Hickok, the man beneath the wide-brimmed hat, the one who wrote her tender letters, who called her my darling and dreamed of a quiet home. They exchanged heartfelt notes, full of longing, reflections on time lost, and promises made in ink. His rough hands could shoot a pistol at full gallop, but they also wrote with a surprisingly poetic grace. On March 5, 1876, in Cheyenne, Wyoming, they were married. It was a small private affair held in the simple elegance of a community parlor. Bill, at 38, stood tall in his wedding coat, still carrying the weight of 1,000 stories in his eyes. Agnes, 49, wore a calm smile, knowing perhaps that this union was less about forever and more about finally. But the dream was short-lived. Just weeks after their wedding, Bill made a fateful decision. Gold had been discovered in the Black Hills, and men flooded to Deadwood, Dakota territory. With visions of fortune, Charlie Utter, one of Bill's old friends and partners, was organizing a wagon train. Bill couldn't resist. One last adventure, one more gamble, maybe, just maybe, a final claim that would buy him the peace and security he'd never had. He left Agnes behind, either in Ohio or Cheyenne, accounts vary, but the emotion was the same. He promised to return, promised to build them a home, promised this was just a short trip to secure their future. In one of his last letters, Hickok wrote, "Agnes, if anything should happen to me, I want you to know how entirely I love you. I would rather have one little moment with you than a lifetime with anyone else." He traveled with Charlie Utter's wagon company, along with several performers, gamblers, miners, and Calamity Jane, whose own connection to Bill would later become the stuff of murky myth. They rolled into Deadwood in July 1876, a lawless boomtown clawed out of the mountains. There was gold in the ground, whiskey on every corner, and death waiting around every poker table. Bill, ever the gambler, soon found that mining wasn't his future. The claims were all bought up or worthless. Instead, he returned to what he knew best, cards. But time was catching up with him. He had been diagnosed with glaucoma and trachoma, diseases that blurred his sharp vision and made it harder to focus on distant objects. He couldn't shoot like he once could. He knew it. Others didn't. But he carried his pistols anyway, wore them low in the cavalry cross-draw style, handles reversed, as he always had. The legend had to look the part, even if the man inside was fraying. Every day he played poker in the saloons, usually at Nuttall and Mann's Saloon No. 10, his back always to the wall. Years of surviving ambushes taught him to never leave himself exposed. But on August 2nd, 1876, there were no safe seats left. The only chair open placed his back to the door. Hickok hesitated. He asked another player to trade places. The man refused. Tired, perhaps too polite or too resigned, Bill sat down. His final mistake. A man named Jack McCall, drunk and bitter over a perceived insult from Hickok the day before, entered the saloon through the rear. He had a .45 revolver and vengeance on his mind. Bill was holding a hand of cards, 2 black aces and 2 black eights, now famously remembered as the dead man S-hand. McCall walked up behind him and pulled the trigger. Bill never saw it coming. The bullet tore through the back of his head and exited beneath his right eye. He died instantly, collapsing over the table. Another man across from him was wounded by the same shot. Chaos erupted. Jack McCall tried to flee, but was quickly captured. Just months after vowing a future to his wife, Wild Bill Hickok was dead, murdered at the age of 39, in a lawless gold town where the rules had never caught up with the dreams of men. Back in Cheyenne, or perhaps in Ohio, Agnes received the news. There's no record of her reaction, no weeping journal entries or public grief. She was a woman of the circus, familiar with spectacle, loss, and the fragility of every promise. But she never remarried. She kept Wild Bill's letters, likely rereading them when the world grew quiet. She lived until 1907, surviving the man she loved by over 30 years. And though Bill was laid to rest in Deadwood's Mount Moriah Cemetery, Agnes never saw his grave. Yet in death, as in life, they remained connected. 2 souls from opposite worlds who met in the middle of history, just long enough to write a final chapter of humanity into the legend of a gunslinger. By the summer of 1876, James Butler, Wild Bill Hickok, was no longer just a man. He was a walking legend. His name echoed through every dusty saloon and across the open plains of the American West. Men wanted to be him, some wanted to kill him, and a few brave ones simply wanted to watch him play cards, a living myth with 6 shooters at his hips, and stories of gunfights and duels trailing behind him like smoke. But even legends get tired. Following his brief marriage to Agnes Lake, the refined and cultured widow from the East, Wild Bill found himself once again lured westward by the eternal siren call of gold. Rumors had swept across the country. The Black Hills, deep in the Dakota Territory, were rich with gold, wealth, and opportunity. Towns were exploding out of the earth, hastily built and barely governed, and at the heart of it all was a name that burned like a flare: Deadwood. With his old friend Charlie Utter leading a well-supplied wagon train and the notorious Calamity Jane joining in the mix, Hickok rode toward what would unknowingly become his final destination. Their arrival in Deadwood in July of 1876 was met with fanfare and awe. Locals lined the muddy streets, not for the gold or the goods, but for the figures riding into town. The prostitutes in Utter's caravan were cheered. The sight of Calamity Jane, rumored to be a gun-slinging hellcat, caused whispers. But it was Wild Bill who turned heads and straightened spines. He wore his signature long frock coat, wide-brimmed hat, and twin pistols in reverse draw. His hair had grown longer, now streaked with grey. He was only 39, but decades of hard living had worn down his body and spirit. And worse, his eyes were failing him. Hickok had been quietly battling glaucoma and trachoma, diseases that blurred his once eagle-sharp vision. For a man who had made a name outdrawing enemies in the blink of an eye, this was more than a nuisance. It was a death sentence creeping silently behind him. In the rugged chaos of Deadwood, Wild Bill initially tried his hand at mining. He had come, after all, to make enough money to return to Agnes and settle into a life of comfort and respectability. But the goldfields had already been staked by others. Fortune here was measured not in shovels of earth, but in the turn of a card. So Bill did what he knew. He turned back to poker, the game that had both sustained and nearly ruined him many times before. He became a fixture at Nuttall and Mann's Saloon No. 10, where the whiskey flowed like rivers and tension lived in every corner. Day after day he played, watching, studying, betting, but this time he didn't sit with his back to the wall. Maybe it was fatigue, maybe it was resignation, or maybe, just maybe, he was tired of running from death. He'd often request to trade chairs, preferring always to sit facing the entrance, his instincts sharp as ever. But on August 2nd, there was no seat left but the one with its back to the door. And so for once Wild Bill Hickok sat exposed. He still looked the part, still radiated danger. But many in town whispered that he was slower now. His hand hovered just a little longer before drawing. His eyes squinted when reading the cards. The once untouchable aura around him had begun to crack. And in Deadwood, cracks meant opportunity. Enter Jack McCall, a drunk, angry, and desperate man. He had lost heavily at cards the day before, allegedly at a table where Hickok showed him pity and gave him money for breakfast. But pity was poison to men like McCall. That night, drunk on rage and rotgut, he swore vengeance. The next day, he would act. Meanwhile, Wild Bill was holding what would be his final hand, seated at the poker table, with 2 black aces and 2 black eights, a hand that would forever become known as the Dead Man S-hand. Bill was mid-game when McCall entered through the back of the saloon. He walked directly up behind Hickok. What happened next took only a second. "Damn you, take that!" McCall is said to have shouted. Then he pulled the trigger. The .45 caliber bullet tore through the back of Wild Bill S. head and exited beneath his right eye. He was dead before he hit the table. The cards fell from his hand. Blood pooled across the worn green felt. One of the other players was struck by the same bullet, but survived. The room erupted in chaos. McCall fled, trying to mount a horse, but the saddle slipped. He ran, stumbled, and was caught in a butcher shop by enraged townsfolk. Lacking formal law enforcement, they locked him in an outhouse until a miners' court could be convened. There he claimed he had killed Hickok because Bill had murdered his brother in Kansas, a lie later proven false. But Deadwood, lawless and new, was not part of any official U.S. territory. The court had no authority, and astonishingly, Jack McCall was acquitted. He fled Deadwood, running to Wyoming and bragging of his deed in saloons and campfires. But justice, like a slow-burning fuse, caught up with him. A federal warrant was issued and McCall was arrested. This time, under legitimate U.S. jurisdiction, he was tried again, found guilty, and hanged in March of 1877. As for Wild Bill, his body was laid to rest by his friend Charlie Utter in Deadwood's Ingleside Cemetery, later moved to Mount Moriah, where his grave still overlooks the hills he never conquered. In a letter, Wild Bill had once written to Agnes, "If this reaches you, I will be gone, but know this, I loved you entirely." Agnes never remarried, and though Deadwood would later romanticize Bill S.'s relationship with Calamity Jane, going so far as to bury her beside him years later, the truth remained silent beneath stone. His heart had belonged to Agnes, and his final days were haunted not by the guns of enemies, but by the slow erosion of his body, the burden of his past, and the inevitability of fate. So ended the life of Wild Bill Hickok, not in a dusty duel at high noon, but at a poker table in a town that swallowed men whole. He was the last of the great gunfighters, a man who walked the line between myth and mortal. And in the end, it was not speed, nor skill, nor bravery that saved him. Only memory remains. The town of Deadwood in the Dakota Territory was a crucible of greed, gunpowder, and gold. In the summer of 1876, it pulsed with promise, danger, and vice. an outlaw boomtown nestled deep within the Black Hills, drawing fortune-seekers, gamblers, and outlaws from across the continent. Among them was a man whose name had become synonymous with justice, danger, and myth, James Butler Hickok, known to the world as Wild Bill. But this was no longer the prime of his legend. Hickok arrived in Deadwood weathered, cautious, and visibly aged. His once razor-sharp eyesight had dimmed with glaucoma, and his trigger hand, though steady, moved just a touch slower. He still carried the aura of a killer, the look of a man who had lived too long under the weight of his own reputation. But time and enemies were closing in. By August 2nd, 1876, Wild Bill had only been in Deadwood for a few weeks. He'd come west with dreams of staking a gold claim and returning to his new bride, Agnes Lake, with pockets full of riches. But Deadwood wasn't a town that gave anything away easily. The mines were already claimed, and the town's undercurrent of violence had no room for aging legends. So Wild Bill returned to the one frontier he still trusted, the poker table. Each day he could be found inside Nuttall and Mann's Saloon No. 10, a smoky, crowded gambling den, where whiskey poured like water and fortunes changed hands with each turn of a card. Hickok was a known figure, even here. Men leaned in to whisper his name when he entered. Some admired him, others itched to make a name by ending him, and one man wanted revenge. His name was Jack McCall. A drunk, a failed gambler, and a nobody in the eyes of Deadwood's regulars, McCall had lost heavily at cards the day before, possibly to Hickok himself. Wild Bill, ever the professional gambler, had reportedly handed McCall a few coins for breakfast and advised him not to play again until he could afford to lose. That gesture, meant as pity, became a wound to McCall's pride. That night, he vowed to kill Wild Bill. The next day, August 2nd, the saloon was loud with the clatter of glasses and chips. Hickok was playing poker with three others: Carl Mann, co-owner of the saloon, Bill Massey, a Missouri riverboat captain, and Charles Rich, a gambler and regular in the establishment. One seat was empty, facing the back of the saloon with its wooden swinging doors and unseen dangers. Wild Bill, ever cautious, typically avoided sitting with his back exposed. He preferred to see the room, read the crowd, catch danger before it struck. That day he asked Charles Rich to swap seats, but Rich refused, saying, "You're not in any danger here, Bill." Reluctantly, Hickok sat down. He was dealt his cards: 2 black aces, 2 black eights. The 5th card remains unknown. Some say it was the 9 of diamonds. Others say it had yet to be dealt. But what mattered most was that 4 cards were visible, cards that would become legendary. Then came McCall. He entered silently through the back of the saloon, walked calmly up behind Hickok, and without a word of warning, pulled a .45 caliber revolver from beneath his coat. He shouted, "Damn you, take that!" and pulled the trigger. The shot echoed like a thunderclap. The bullet struck Wild Bill in the back of the head, exiting through his right cheek. He slumped forward, dead before he even heard the sound. The cards in his hand fell lifelessly to the table. 2 black aces and 2 black eights, now known forever as the dead man's hand. Across the table, Bill Massey took the same bullet in his left wrist, shattering the bone. McCall turned, ran from the room, and stumbled into the dusty street. He attempted to mount a horse, but the saddle had been loosened. He fell. Panicked, he fled down the road toward a butcher shop, where he was captured by enraged townspeople. There was no formal law in Deadwood, no sheriff, no courthouse, no federal authority, so the miners and townsfolk convened a miners' court, a rough frontier version of justice. McCall claimed that Wild Bill had murdered his brother in Abilene, Kansas, and that he had acted in revenge. The court, lacking evidence and swayed by emotion, acquitted McCall after just a few hours. The town gasped in disbelief. McCall walked away a free man. But the story doesn't end there. McCall, drunk on his false triumph, began bragging across Wyoming that he had killed Wild Bill Hickok. In a more civilized town, his words reached the ears of federal authorities. Since Deadwood had no legal jurisdiction at the time of his trial, being in Indian Territory, the first trial was declared invalid. Double jeopardy did not apply. McCall was arrested by U.S. Marshals, transported to Yankton, South Dakota, and retried in a federal court. This time, justice was served. On January 3, 1877, Jack McCall was found guilty of murder. On March 1st, he was hanged, ironically, with the same type of rope he had once claimed would never touch his neck. He was buried in an unmarked grave behind the gallows, still wearing the noose. And what of Wild Bill? His body was laid to rest by Charlie Utter, his closest friend, first at Ingleside Cemetery, and later moved to Mount Moriah Cemetery, overlooking Deadwood. The town grieved. Calamity Jane claimed years later that she had captured McCall herself with a meat cleaver, another of her many wild tales. But what could not be disputed was this: a legend had fallen. The cards he held became iconic. The dead man's hand would live on in books, games, tattoos, and the imaginations of generations to come. Songs would be written. Saloon Number 10 would become a pilgrimage site. Wild Bill Hickok had become what he never asked to be: immortal. Yet his death was more than just a moment frozen in folklore. It was the symbolic end of the gunfighter era. The West was changing, law was creeping in, railroads would soon stitch the wilderness together, and men like Wild Bill, lone figures who walked between law and legend, no longer had a place. But if Deadwood taught the world anything, it's that memory burns longer than flesh. And so the man with the flowing hair, the twin Colts, and the iron stare remains etched into the mythos of the American West, not for how he lived, but for the way he died. Cards in hand, back to the door, face calm, fate accepted. When the bullet struck James Butler Hickok on that fateful day in Deadwood, it did more than silence a man. It immortalized a legend. In an instant, a life lived on horseback, in saloons, across battlefields, and beneath wide western skies, ended. But the myth of Wild Bill Hickok was just beginning. They buried him first in Ingleside Cemetery, a small patch of earth on a hillside above the lawless gold camp that had claimed his life. His grave was simple, watched over by his closest friend, Charlie Utter, who wept at the loss of a man he called brother. But Hickok's rest would not be eternal there. As Deadwood grew and changed, the town chose to honor its fallen hero by moving his remains to a more prominent site: the newly established Mount Moriah Cemetery, high above the city, where pine trees swayed like sentinels and the winds carried whispers of the past. There, on a hill overlooking the very streets where his blood had stained the floorboards of Saloon Number 10, Hickok was reinterred, this time beneath a monument worthy of his legacy. But even in death, Wild Bill would not be left alone. Years later, when Martha Jane Canary, known to the world as Calamity Jane, was laid to rest, it was at her request, and perhaps to Deadwood's amusement, that she was buried beside him. Though the truth of their relationship remains murky, the myth has endured, that she loved him, perhaps unrequited, perhaps unspoken, and that being buried beside him was her final way of joining the legend. And what a legend it became! Hickok's name spread beyond the dusty streets of the Dakota Territory, beyond the frontier, and beyond the lifespans of those who had known him. The 19th century press, always hungry for heroes and villains, turned him into a titan. Newspapers painted him as a man who could shoot the ace of spades from a deck at 50 paces, who never missed, who never flinched, who never backed down. His story was told and retold in Harper's Magazine, in dime novels, in vaudeville acts, and later in the silver screen epics of Hollywood. The real Hickok, the complex, aging, troubled man, was lost in the translation. In his place rose a figure larger than life, the perfect gunfighter, the embodiment of honor and violence, the ultimate frontier justice. Tales of his duels became embellished to the point of fantasy. It was said he once faced down 10 men alone, that he shot out candles in saloons just to prove a point, that he saved towns with a single glare and brought law to chaos with the pull of a trigger. Some stories even claimed he had killed over 100 men, a number both impossible and unnecessary for his legend. And at the heart of every tale was the image of Wild Bill, tall with flowing hair, a pair of ivory-handled Colt Navy revolvers, and a reputation as sharp as his aim. But it wasn't just the newspapers that immortalized him. Hollywood seized him, as it did with so many frontier names. Hickok was portrayed by actors like Gary Cooper, Jeff Bridges, Sam Elliott, and Josh Brolin. Each generation rediscovered him through celluloid dreams, adapting his story for their time. Sometimes faithful, often fantastical. From silent films to modern westerns, Wild Bill Hickok became shorthand for a certain type of American man. Brave, bold, doomed. His name became etched into amusement parks, road signs, school books, television series, video games, and toys. He was inducted into the Hall of Great Western Performers, his face plastered on everything from posters to poker chips. And always, always was the image of that final hand, the dead man's hand, 2 black aces, 2 black eights, the cards of destiny. Historians have long debated how much of Hickok's story is fact and how much is fable. Was he truly the fastest gun in the West, or simply the first to be mythologized by mass media? Did he really kill dozens in duels, or was he a man who tried to avoid violence when possible? Some scholars point out his own discomfort with fame, his attempts to fade into quieter lives, his desire for peace in the last years of his life. What is not in doubt is that Hickok was among the first true American celebrities, a man whose fame exploded not by royal birth or political power, but by the raw magnetism of his story. He became the template for every Western hero who followed, from Wyatt Earp to John Wayne, from Clint Eastwood's Man with No Name to modern anti-heroes who walk alone, battle-weary and haunted by the choices they've made. And in the hills above Deadwood, where the wind still moves through the evergreens, and tourists still tread the gravel paths to pay their respects, Wild Bill Hickok lies forever on watch. Beside him lies Calamity Jane, the unlikely companion whose presence adds another layer to the myth. Their graves have become pilgrimage sites, not just for lovers of the Old West, but for those who yearn for a time when men lived and died by the steel of their will, and where justice could be dealt with a glance and a gun. In the end, Hickok's true legacy is this. He became America's first mythic gunslinger, forged in the real crucible of war, law, and death, and polished by the fantasies of a nation that longed for heroes. He remains both man and myth, mortal and immortal, a shot echoing across the plains of time, and as long as the legends of the West are told, the name Wild Bill Hickok will never die.